David Washington sat comfortably in the VIP lounge, waiting for his flight. He was a black man in his mid-40s, the CEO of a successful tech company, a man who had worked tirelessly to get to this point in his life. He was dressed in a smart suit, his hair neatly combed, his shoes shining. Today was just like any other business trip. He had finished his meetings early, and now he was headed back home to catch up with his family. David was used to the luxuries of first-class travel. It wasn't something he took for granted, but it was a perk that came with the hard work and determination he had poured into his career. He had spent years proving himself in boardrooms filled with men who were often skeptical of his abilities because of the color of his skin. But now, as a successful CEO, those struggles seemed far behind him. Or so he thought. He looked around the lounge, where fellow travelers were busy with their own activities. Some were sipping coffee, others were typing away on laptops or talking on the phone. Everyone seemed busy with their own thoughts, but David noticed something that caught his attention. A flight attendant walked past him, looking at him with a neutral expression. She wasn't the one who usually served in the VIP lounge, but he noticed that she seemed to be glancing at him a little more than was necessary. David thought little of it at first. It wasn't unusual to have people eyeing him from time to time. As a black man in a suit, especially in a place like this, it wasn't rare to catch someone's attention. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He turned back to his phone, scrolling through his emails, but that unease lingered. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned. She was holding a clipboard and walking directly toward him. "Mr. Washington," she said politely, "I'm sorry to inform you, but your seat assignment has been changed." David blinked in surprise. He had a first-class seat, one that he had carefully selected when booking the flight. It wasn't just a seat, it was a symbol of the hard work he had put into his career. "I'm sorry, what do you mean my seat has been changed?" he asked, his voice calm but confused. She explained that due to a mistake in the system, his seat in first class was no longer available. David's first instinct was to push back. After all, it wasn't his fault if there had been an error. He had earned that seat. But instead of demanding an explanation, David took a deep breath. "Where would you like me to sit then?" he asked. The flight attendant, almost too quickly, pointed to a seat in the economy class section. The seat was located toward the back of the plane, far from the comfort of the first-class cabin he had paid for. It wasn't just a downgrade, it was a slap in the face. David stood up, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. As he walked past the first-class cabin, he could feel the stares of the other passengers, their eyes shifting toward him as he made his way to the back of the plane. David's heart pounded, and for a moment, he wondered if anyone even cared about what had just happened. But as he sat down in the cramped economy seat, he realized that this wasn't just about a mix-up in seat assignments. This was something deeper. This was about being a black man in a world that still saw him as less than. Despite his success, despite all that he had achieved, he was still being treated like he didn't belong in spaces like first class. David tried to push the thought away, telling himself to calm down. But the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about years of being overlooked, of working harder than anyone else to prove that he deserved to be where he was. And yet, time and time again, the world seemed to remind him that as a black man, he was always going to have to fight a little harder to earn his place. As he settled into the uncomfortable seat, David tried to distract himself by reading his emails, but the words blurred before his eyes. All he could think about was the flight attendant, the way she had seemed almost too eager to take his seat away. He looked out the window, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The sky outside was a deep blue, and the clouds looked soft and distant. But even the beauty of the scene couldn't ease the frustration that was bubbling inside him. The flight attendants were making their way through the aisles, serving drinks and snacks. They seemed oblivious to what had just happened. They moved through the cabin as if everything was normal, unaware of the discomfort David was feeling. And then, to his surprise, the same flight attendant who had taken his seat assignment walked past him. She looked at him briefly, but there was no acknowledgement of what had transpired. David's mind raced. This wasn't just an error in seat assignments. It wasn't just a simple mix-up. It was a reminder, a very real reminder, of how little some people cared about what black people had to go through to get where they were. David wasn't just a CEO, he was also a black man, and in moments like this, that fact seemed to matter more than his accomplishments. He felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, pushed aside, or ignored. He had the power to change this. He had the power to stand up and make sure people knew that this kind of treatment wouldn't be tolerated anymore. David stood up from his seat, his back straight, his shoulders squared. He wasn't sure what he was going to say yet, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to sit quietly while this injustice went unchallenged. It wasn't just his seat that had been taken, it was his dignity. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. David stood up from his seat, a mix of frustration and determination building inside him. The plane's cabin, full of passengers going about their usual routines, seemed oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in his mind. As he walked down the narrow aisle, the low hum of conversations and the soft rattle of the plane's engines filled the air, but all David could focus on was the unfairness of the situation. The flight attendants were moving through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, but David didn't pay them any attention. His mind was spinning, and his thoughts were racing. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It wasn't just about the small mistake that had been made. It was about a larger issue, one that David had felt all his life. The feeling that, no matter how much he achieved, no matter how much he worked, there were always barriers set in place because of the color of his skin. David was a successful CEO. He had built his company from the ground up, battling countless obstacles, many of which had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way people perceived him. He had fought tooth and nail to get where he was, earning respect and admiration from colleagues and business leaders. But now, sitting in this cramped seat, he was reminded that, in certain spaces, none of that seemed to matter. He made his way to the front of the plane, feeling every pair of eyes on him. It was strange, people had seen him walk through the lounge earlier, all confident and composed. But now, walking through the plane, David couldn't shake the feeling that people were watching him differently. Some passengers were staring at him with curiosity, others with confusion, but no one seemed to understand what had just happened. When he reached the front, the head flight attendant, a tall woman with a stern expression, was overseeing the seating arrangement. She didn't seem to notice David approaching at first. He cleared his throat to catch her attention, and she finally looked up, a polite but somewhat distant smile on her face. "Excuse me," David said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I need to speak with someone about the seat change. This doesn't feel right." The flight attendant's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, her professionalism kicking in. "Sir, I understand your frustration," she said in a calm voice. "But this was an issue with the system, and we had to make adjustments to ensure all passengers were seated appropriately." David's jaw tightened. "I don't think it's about a system error," he said firmly. "I was in first class, and now I've been moved to economy. I'm asking why. I paid for that seat." The attendant glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. "It was a decision made by our supervisor," she said quickly, her tone slightly defensive. "We had to accommodate a passenger in need of special assistance, and the seat in first class was reassigned." David stared at her for a moment, weighing his next words carefully. He could feel his blood pressure rising, but he also knew that this wasn't the time to let anger cloud his judgment. He wasn't just going to let this slide. He wasn't going to let it be brushed off as a small mistake. "Special assistance?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "So, a white passenger gets my seat, and I'm the one who's asked to move." His voice was calm but carried an underlying edge that made the flight attendant pause. David wasn't sure why he felt so sure about what was happening, but in that moment, it became clear to him. This wasn't just a simple mix-up. This was something deeper. He had seen it before. The looks. The subtle treatment that suggested he didn't belong in certain spaces, no matter how hard he worked or how far he'd come. The flight attendant's eyes flicked nervously, and David could tell she was struggling to find the right words. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir," she said, her tone shifting to one of apology. "It wasn't meant to disrespect you." David nodded, but he wasn't satisfied with her response. He wanted more. He deserved more. And he wasn't going to back down. "I'm not asking for an apology," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm asking why this happened. Why am I being treated like this?" The flight attendant hesitated, her face flushing with discomfort. It was clear that she didn't know how to handle the situation, but David wasn't going to let it go. He needed answers. He needed to make sure that this wasn't swept under the rug, that this wouldn't just be another story of injustice ignored. "I want to speak with the captain," David said, his tone resolute. The flight attendant nodded, and with a quick glance, she motioned toward the cockpit. "I'll have him come speak with you," she said softly, as if offering some sort of consolation. But David wasn't looking for consolation. He wasn't looking for apologies. He was looking for action. As the flight attendant left to fetch the captain, David returned to his seat. He sat down, but it wasn't in defeat. It wasn't with resignation. He wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. The minutes felt like hours as David waited for the captain to arrive. He glanced around the cabin, seeing a few passengers whispering to each other, probably wondering what was going on. Others seemed to be staring at him, some curious, others uncomfortable. But David didn't care about their stares. He wasn't fighting for their approval. He was fighting for something bigger than that, something that went beyond this flight, beyond this moment. He was fighting for respect. Finally, the captain appeared at the front of the plane. He was a tall man, wearing a crisp uniform, his expression professional but not unfazed. He walked toward David with a calm but serious demeanor, as though this was just another issue he had to resolve. "Mr. Washington, I'm Captain Stevens," he said, extending his hand. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding with your seat assignment." David stood up and shook the captain's hand, but he didn't let go of his determination. "It's more than a misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady. "I'm asking you, as the captain of this flight, why I was moved from my seat. I've paid for that seat, and I deserve to be treated with respect." Captain Stevens nodded, acknowledging David's point. "I understand your frustration, sir. However, as the crew explained, the reassignment was made to accommodate a special request. We did our best to follow procedure." David's gaze never wavered. "Procedure? Or was this just an easy way to push me out of a seat I've earned? You didn't even make an effort to explain it until I asked." There was a long silence as the captain considered David's words. Finally, he sighed. "You're right," he said, his voice softer now. "We should have handled it better. I'll make sure we address this with the crew." David nodded, but he wasn't satisfied. He wasn't going to walk away just because someone apologized. He wanted more than just words. He wanted change. "Thank you," David said, though his tone was less than appreciative. "But this doesn't end here. You'll be hearing from me after this flight. I'm not going to let this go." The captain nodded again, his expression now somber. "Understood, Mr. Washington." As the captain walked away, David sat back down in his seat, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And when he landed, he would make sure the world knew exactly what had happened. The plane continued its steady course through the sky, but inside, David's thoughts were anything but calm. As the hours passed, he sat in his cramped seat, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The earlier conversation with the captain had done little to ease his frustration. The apology had been polite, but it wasn't enough. David knew that this wasn't just about him, it was about something much bigger. This wasn't just one mistake, it was a reflection of the everyday struggles that many people of color faced, even in a world that often promised equality and opportunity. David thought back to the countless meetings he'd attended, the boardrooms where he had often been the only black face in the room. He had earned every ounce of respect he had, not just by being a skilled businessman, but by being someone who knew how to navigate the invisible barriers set in place by people who didn't think he belonged. But in this moment, on this flight, he couldn't ignore it. The world had just reminded him, in the most public way possible, that no matter how far he'd come, he would always have to fight a little harder to be treated as an equal. As the plane hummed along, David made a decision. He wasn't going to sit quietly. He wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug, forgotten by the time the plane touched down. He would make sure that what had happened on this flight was not just acknowledged, but addressed in a meaningful way. David reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. He opened the camera app, staring at the screen for a moment, unsure of what he would do with it. But then, an idea formed. If the crew and the airline weren't going to take his complaints seriously, maybe it was time to make the world hear his voice. He started recording. The flight attendants were still moving through the cabin, serving drinks and snacks to passengers, but David wasn't paying attention to them anymore. His focus was on the injustice he had just experienced. With the cameras still rolling, David stood up once again. He made his way to the front of the plane, his steps purposeful, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the front, one of the flight attendants who had been involved in the seat reassignment was talking to another passenger. David waited for her to finish, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. Some passengers seemed to sense the tension in the air, their gazes lingering on him. He could feel their curiosity, their questions. Finally, the flight attendant turned and saw David standing there. She seemed startled at first, as though she hadn't expected him to approach again. "Is there something else, Mr. Washington?" she asked, trying to keep her voice professional, but it lacked the confidence it had earlier. David didn't hesitate. "I want to make it clear that I won't be ignored," he said firmly, the cameras still capturing every word. "This situation has nothing to do with an error. It has everything to do with how people like me are treated, even when they've earned their place. I paid for my seat, and I should be able to sit in it without being questioned or moved because of who I am." The flight attendant's expression changed, though it was hard to tell if it was one of guilt or defensiveness. "Mr. Washington, we're doing our best to accommodate all passengers," she said, her voice softer now. David shook his head. "This isn't about accommodation. This is about respect. About recognizing that people of color deserve the same treatment, the same consideration, as anyone else." He paused, taking a breath. "I don't want an apology. What I want is for this to be addressed. Not just for me, but for anyone who faces this kind of treatment every day." The flight attendant glanced down at the floor for a moment, clearly struggling with how to respond. David wasn't surprised. He didn't expect her to have all the answers. But he wasn't doing this for her. He was doing this because he knew the only way things would change was if people stood up and said, "Enough." David could feel the growing energy in the room. The passengers around him were starting to notice. He didn't know if it was the camera in his hand or the way he was speaking, but something in the air had shifted. More people were looking at him now, some even pulling out their own phones to record the moment. He wasn't sure if they were supporting him or just curious, but it didn't matter. The message he was sending was clear: this wasn't just about one flight. This was about a larger issue. This was about fairness, about equality. "I'm going to take this further," David said, his voice steady and strong. "This isn't something I'm just going to let go. I'm going to make sure the airline hears about this, and I'm going to make sure people understand that these things are still happening. Every day, in small ways and big ways, people are being treated differently because of their race. It's not okay. It's time for it to stop." The flight attendant looked at him, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. "Mr. Washington, I understand your frustration," she said quietly. "I will make sure the captain is informed of your concerns." David nodded. "I hope you do," he said, his tone softening just a little. "But this isn't about one person. This is about changing how we treat each other. We all deserve respect, no matter where we sit." As the attendant turned away, David stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of what he had just done. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but he knew he had made a statement. The eyes of the other passengers were still on him, some with empathy, some with curiosity. But David didn't care. He wasn't looking for their approval. He was looking to make sure that what happened to him would not be forgotten. Sitting back down in his seat, David took a deep breath. The flight still had a long way to go, but for the first time in hours, he felt like he had taken control of the situation. The injustice of being moved from his seat, the feeling of being overlooked and disrespected, had been heard. And no matter how this flight ended, David knew that this was only the beginning. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone on that plane that they, too, had the power to speak out. To demand fairness. To demand respect. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, David closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engine settle his nerves. There was still a long way to go, but he was determined. His fight wasn't over yet. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, David couldn't shake the feeling that his actions had set something in motion. His words were now echoing in his mind, and he knew that he had spoken up for more than just a seat on an airplane. He had spoken up for everyone who had ever been treated as less than. Everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel like they didn't belong in places where they had every right to be. David's hands rested on his lap, and his gaze wandered toward the window, where the clouds seemed endless. The beautiful, vast sky outside contrasted sharply with the growing tension inside the plane. The reality of the situation was settling in. His confrontation with the flight crew wasn't just a personal moment of frustration, it had become a public statement, and now it was out of his hands. It was impossible to ignore how the passengers around him were reacting. Some had already started whispering to one another, murmuring about what had just taken place. Others were watching him intently, their eyes filled with curiosity. David was no longer just a businessman on a flight. He was now a symbol of something much larger. The flight attendant, who had spoken with him earlier, came back down the aisle with a serious expression on her face. She approached David's seat with caution, as if unsure how to continue the conversation. David sat up straighter, waiting for her to speak. He could feel the weight of the moment, but he wasn't going to back down. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice hesitant. "I've informed the captain about your concerns, and we've been instructed to make a report about what happened. They've also asked that I apologize once again on behalf of the airline." David looked at her for a moment, taking in her words. He appreciated the fact that she was trying to do her job, but he knew that an apology wasn't enough. The issue wasn't just about making amends for a simple misunderstanding. It was about changing the way people were treated, particularly in places of power. "I don't need your apology," David said firmly, his voice steady. "I need action. I need the airline to realize that this kind of behavior has consequences. If this wasn't just a mistake, but a reflection of a deeper issue, then the airline needs to take responsibility for that. The flight attendant's eyes flickered briefly, and David could see the weight of his words landing on her. She seemed to understand that this wasn't going to go away quietly, and that made David feel even more determined. He knew that even if the airline tried to sweep this under the rug, he wouldn't let it happen. As the hours stretched on, the plane's engines continued to hum, and the passengers continued to watch him. There was a growing sense of unease in the air, not just for David, but for everyone who had witnessed the scene. People were beginning to take note, and that was exactly what David wanted. He wasn't just confronting the crew, he was challenging the system that allowed things like this to happen in the first place. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it out to find a message from his assistant, Lisa. She had forwarded him a news article about the incident already starting to spread on social media. The headline read, "CEO removed from VIP seat in airline incident, the power of speaking up." David stared at the screen for a moment, then typed a quick response, asking her to monitor the situation and keep him updated. The story was starting to snowball, and the media attention would only make the airline's response more important. As the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they were preparing for descent, David felt a mix of emotions. The flight had been long, and his nerves were starting to settle, but there was still a sense of urgency within him. This wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until he knew that real change would come from this. David sat back in his seat and glanced around. The passengers who had been eyeing him earlier now seemed more hesitant, unsure of how to act. Some of them were still recording videos on their phones, capturing the moment. David couldn't help but wonder what they would do with those videos. Would they share them to raise awareness? Or would they forget what had happened the moment they stepped off the plane? The plane began its descent, and David's thoughts returned to the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him, this wasn't just about one unfairly reassigned seat. It was about the countless times people of color had been treated as invisible in spaces that were supposed to be open to everyone. The feeling of being othered had followed him throughout his entire career. But now, as a CEO with a platform and a voice, David knew he had the power to amplify that voice in a way that could spark real change. As the plane touched down and the seat belt sign clicked off, David gathered his belongings and stood up. He was no longer the man who had sat down at the start of the flight. He had spoken up, and he had made his point. But now it was time to take the next steps. The airline may have been willing to apologize, but he wasn't going to let them simply say sorry and move on. They needed to do better. They needed to be held accountable. As David walked down the aisle to disembark, he saw the flight attendants who had been involved in the situation. They avoided eye contact with him, probably hoping that the incident would just fade away. But David wasn't about to let that happen. He'd already made it clear that he wouldn't stay silent, and he wasn't about to stop now. When he reached the gate, he was met by a member of the airline's customer service team. She was polite but visibly nervous, probably aware that the situation had escalated far beyond what anyone had expected. "Mr. Washington, we deeply apologize for the inconvenience you've experienced," she said, offering a handshake. "We'd like to offer you a voucher for your next flight as a gesture of goodwill." David shook his head and smiled faintly. "I don't need a voucher," he said. "What I need is for the airline to take this seriously and ensure that something like this never happens again. No one should have to go through this." The customer service representative nodded, taking his words to heart. David could see that she genuinely wanted to help, but he knew that it would take more than a simple apology or a voucher to fix the deeper issues. As he walked away, David felt a renewed sense of determination. The incident on the plane had sparked something in him, and he wasn't going to let it fizzle out. He would take the next steps, make sure the airline followed through with real change, and use his voice to speak up for others who didn't have the same platform. David had already started to plan his next move. He would work with advocacy groups, gather support from other professionals who had experienced similar treatment, and push for policies that would protect people of color from being treated unfairly, especially in places where they were supposed to be equal. This was just the beginning, and David wasn't going to stop until things changed. As David walked through the bustling airport terminal, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just happened. The entire flight had been a whirlwind, a moment of frustration, followed by a powerful decision to stand up for himself and for everyone who had ever felt overlooked or mistreated. But now that he had taken that stand, he understood that the real challenge was just beginning. The airline had offered an apology, but that wasn't enough. David had spoken up, and he wasn't going to let this moment fade away into silence. He knew that if nothing changed, this would just be another instance of a system that didn't hold people accountable for their actions. And David wasn't going to allow that. He had come too far in his life and career to let this incident be forgotten, swept under the rug like so many others. As he walked toward the exit, he was met by a group of reporters who had caught wind of the story. Their cameras were trained on him, and their questions began to pour in. They wanted to know what had happened, why he had chosen to speak out, and what he hoped would come of it. David paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He knew that this was his chance to amplify his message, to make sure that his story wasn't just a personal one, but one that resonated with others. "I didn't speak up today because I'm a CEO or because I wanted attention," he said, his voice calm but strong. "I spoke up because I want people to understand that we all deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who we are. It's about fairness. It's about dignity. And it's about the fact that no one should have to fight just to exist in spaces where they've earned the right to be." The reporters nodded, their cameras capturing every word. David could feel the weight of the moment. He knew that the story was about to reach a much larger audience. But more than that, he understood the importance of this moment. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. As David continued speaking, his words seemed to echo in the busy airport, catching the attention of passers-by who stopped to listen. He wasn't just talking about his own experience anymore. He was speaking for all the people who had been dismissed, overlooked, or treated unfairly because of their race. And that felt powerful. "I've been in this industry long enough to know that change doesn't come from silence," David continued. "It comes from people speaking out, from challenging the status quo, from making sure that no one is ever made to feel less than because of who they are. This is just one moment, but if it can inspire someone else to stand up when they're treated unfairly, then it's worth it." The reporters were quiet now, absorbed in what David was saying. The energy around them had shifted. This wasn't just a story about a CEO and a seat reassignment. It was a story about standing up for what's right, about making sure that no one had to feel invisible, no matter how much success they had or how hard they worked. As David finished his statement and the reporters moved on to their next questions, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he set out to do. The story was out there now, and it was no longer just about one flight. It was about a larger conversation. A conversation about race, equality, and the importance of standing up for what's right. But David knew that this was only the first step. Speaking out in that moment had been important, but the real work was in making sure that something changed, that the conversation didn't stop with a few headlines and a quick apology from the airline. As the next few days passed, the story continued to make waves. News outlets picked it up, and social media exploded with support. People from all walks of life began sharing their own experiences of discrimination and mistreatment, and the hashtag fairness in flight started trending. It was clear that the story was resonating with people, and David felt a renewed sense of purpose. But there was also something else: the airline's response. They had initially issued a generic apology and promised to investigate the situation. But now, as the public backlash grew, they were forced to take stronger action. They reached out to David personally, offering more than just an apology. They promised to implement company-wide changes to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. They agreed to provide better training for their staff, specifically focusing on racial sensitivity and equality, and they even promised to create a new customer service policy that would prevent any passenger from being treated unfairly based on their race or status. David knew that this wasn't perfect, that it wouldn't solve all the problems in the industry or in society, but it was a start. It was a sign that the company understood the gravity of what had happened and was willing to make tangible changes. Still, David wasn't content to let the airline take all the credit. He knew that if he truly wanted to make a lasting difference, he would have to use his platform for more than just holding others accountable. He would have to take the next step, to advocate for systemic change that would affect not just the airline industry, but every industry where people of color were treated as second-class citizens. He began working with advocacy groups and consulting with other leaders in the business world. He spoke at conferences about diversity, equity, and inclusion, sharing his story and urging others to take action. He used his platform to encourage businesses to examine their own practices, to challenge their biases, and to create a culture of fairness and respect. David's efforts weren't just about changing policies, they were about changing mindsets. He knew that to truly make a difference, people needed to understand that fairness wasn't just a nice idea, it was a necessity. Every day, people were being excluded, ignored, and mistreated because of who they were, and it was time for that to stop. The months that followed saw more progress. Other airlines began to take note of the changes David had helped inspire, and several large companies reached out to him, asking for his advice on how to make their organizations more inclusive. It was clear that the ripple effect from David's actions was far-reaching. But David remained grounded. He knew that this was just the beginning. The journey he had started was far from over, and while he was proud of the progress that had been made, he knew there was much more work to do. He continued to push for changes in the business world and beyond, reminding people that the fight for equality wasn't just a fight for black people, it was a fight for all people, a fight for fairness and dignity in every corner of society. As David stood on stage one day at an international conference on business and leadership, speaking to a packed room of professionals, he smiled to himself. He had come a long way since that flight. But it wasn't just about his journey. It was about the journey of everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. Everyone who had ever been told they didn't deserve to take up space in the world. David's voice rang out, clear and confident, as he addressed the crowd. "We all have the power to make a difference," he said. "It starts with standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And it's about ensuring that no one ever has to feel invisible again." And in that moment, as the applause filled the room, David knew that he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. He was making the world a better place, one step at a time. And nothing, not even an unfairly reassigned seat, could stop him from continuing the fight for fairness, equality, and respect.